Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us for this live stream Latino Leaders Dialogue on how are Latinos changing politics and how are politics changing Latinos, hosted by Georgetown's Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. I'm JD Long Garcia, and I'm a senior editor at America, where I oversee coverage of Latino Catholics in the United States. I want to thank John Carr and Kim Daniels, the co-directors of this initiative, for putting together this online dialogue. I've never hosted a dialogue before, but I've been a panelist, and I've been enriched by the many dialogues that I have attended. It makes me a better person, and I hope it does the same for you. So it's a pleasure and an honor to get a chance to moderate this conversation. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the initiative has organized more than 50 hybrid and online dialogues that have reached more than 200,000 people. So we're grateful to have so many of you joining us today. We've had more than 500 RSVPs for this important conversation. That's 500, and we haven't even finished counting the RSVPs from Nevada and Arizona. Interest in the impact of Latinos in US politics ebbs and flows. Lots of times our role in public life is neglected, minimized, or treated superficially. But sure enough, every 2 or 4 years, the political parties and candidates rediscover that we play a significant role in who wins and who loses. Many people have opinions about who we are and the impact we panelists who are joining us today have consistently covered and been involved with Latino communities before, during, and after elections. They are Julian Castro, served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Barack Obama and is the former mayor of San Antonio and a former Democratic candidate for president. He is currently the Stephen and Maureen Klinsky Visiting Professor of Practice for Leadership and Progress at Harvard Law School. Jens Manuel Krogstad is a senior writer and editor at the Research Center. He has authored or edited hundreds of studies on topics that include global migration, Latino public opinion, Hispanic demographic trends, and US border enforcement. Alejandra Molina is a national reporter covering Latinos and Religion for Religion news service. Previously, she was a reporter at the Southern California News Group, where she covered cities, immigration, race, and religion for newspapers. Michael Okinzik Cruz is the executive director and a co-founder of the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership and an adjunct professor at the Institute for Pastoral Studies at Loyola University of Chicago. And Olivia Perez Cubas is the communications director at Winning for Women and the Super PAC WFW Action Fund, a group committed to electing Republican women and has served in many roles for Senator Marco Rubio. In 2017, she was named one of the top Latino staffers on Capitol Hill by roll call. A special thanks to all of you who are joining us on YouTube and Twitter. We'd invite you to share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag LatinosPolitics22 and by tagging the initiative at GUCST Public Life. We'll also have an opportunity for questions and answers later on, so please submit questions to the panelists by following the prompts at the bottom of the screen. This dialogue is being recorded and will be posted on the initiative's website and social channels for later viewing. So now let's get started in this important conversation. We've been hearing a lot of diverse perspectives and predictions on what's going to happen, and a lot of people speaking on behalf of Latinos. We've heard Latinos are and will be a core part of the Democratic coalition. We've heard Latinos were moving from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Latinos will vote as they always have, we heard, and Latinos are up for grabs. Now we actually have some evidence and experience to analyze and talk about, and the right people to help us understand what is actually happening and what it means for the next 2 years and for the future. So I'd like to begin by asking all of you, what is the single most important thing for us to know about Latinos in US politics? So how are they shaping politics and what might we expect in the future? Jens Manuel, you've researched the changing demographic, political, social, and religious characteristics of US Latinos with Pew, the preeminent source for nonpartisan polling and statistics. And I am on your website all the time. So to you, Jens Manuel, what is the most important thing for us to know about Latinos in US politics?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for boosting our clicks, especially hopefully ones with my byline on it. That's great to hear. I think one important point that's emerged from our research is that Latinos have generally and relatively speaking, weak ties to the Democratic and Republican parties. One example of this is that substantial shares of Latino Democrats and Latino Republicans are slightly liberal economically and more conservative in other areas. So it's no surprise, really, that Latinos have been charting their own path politically, both in recent elections and over the course of decades. During this year's midterms, the GOP appears to have held on to gains they made in 2020, but did not make a lot of gains nationally above and beyond that. The notable exception to this, of course, is Florida, where the early analysis and results suggest Republican candidates made great strides among Latino voters. But the amount of support Latino voters will give to each party in 2024 and beyond, whether nationally at a more local level, I think that's really the million-dollar question, and I don't know that anyone really has an answer to that. Latino voter support for the two parties has ebbed and flowed over the decades. In presidential years, for example, support for Democrats reached a high of around 70% during the Clinton and Obama years. And during the George W. Bush and Donald Trump years, the GOP clawed back support, winning around 40% of Latino voters. Our most recent report on Latino voters from our National Survey of Latinos underscored the fact that many Latino voters do not fit neatly into the nation's polarized two-party system. The story of Latino voters really is a nuanced one, and it continues to be. Our new report finds Latinos are more likely to say the Democratic Party really cares about them than to say the opposite, that the Republican Party really cares about them. And yet, at the same time, about half of Latinos say they don't see a great deal of difference between the parties. And a substantial minority of Latinos, including a substantial number of Latino Democrats, say they think the Republican Party works hard to earn their vote. And so if I had to summarize everything I just said into a single sentence, I would say Latinos do not fit neatly into the nation's polarized two-party system, due in part to the relatively weak ties many, but not all Latinos have to the Democratic and Republican parties.
Thanks, Jim, and we look forward to getting more into that as our dialogue continues. Alejandra, you cover Latinos changing political and religious opinions, two areas that surprised many of us in recent years. What do you say is the most important thing for us to know about Latinos in U.S. politics?
I think for me, a way of better understanding the nuances and complexities of Latinos is through religion. And Religion News Service, I've been covering Latinos and religion for the past, since before the pandemic. And I think learning about how Latinos identify in terms of faith affiliation and whether they don't identify with a religion is really an insightful way to understand how Latinos are and the way they vote. We know that Latinos who are Catholic tend to be more progressive than Latinos who are evangelical and Protestants. And we know that those who aren't affiliated with a religion, including Latinos, tend to be more progressive as well. So really, for me, it has a way of understanding those complexities and nuances has been through religion.
It sounds like something we're going to be coming back to throughout our dialogue here is the complexity of who we are as Latinos, as reflected, I think, by this very talented panel that we have. Olivia, you have an accomplished career contributing to major Republican campaigns and working with Senator Marco Rubio in Florida, where there is a Latino population significant both for its size and for its national political influence. We've been talking a lot about Florida these days. So what do you say is the most important thing for us to know about Latinos in US politics?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think I'd make two main points here. One, that Latinos are not a monolith. I think that they are an incredibly diverse group of people driven by a wide range of issues, from geographical interests, I think very district and community specific reasons, faith, as was just mentioned. And I think people are finally starting to understand this and catch on to this, which is encouraging. And second, I think Latinos are an incredibly powerful and influential voting bloc. They obviously, as we all know, have the ability to sway elections. And speaking with my Republican hat on, the GOP has not historically done very well among Latino voters, but I do think that we are seeing that chip away ever so slightly. For example, this past election, support for Democratic House candidates decreased by 5% from 2020. And I think that is a small shift, but a consistent one. I do think it remains to be seen if the GOP can continue to make inroads, but outreach is key. And I do think kind of long-term thinking 2024 and beyond, that the GOP depends on its ability to grow the tent, to diversify the party, to speak to a very diverse group of people and voters, which, sometimes we are not the best at, but we're working on. And Latinos are very much a big part and a key part of that equation.
Secretary Castro, you don't need any introduction, but you've been the mayor of your majority Hispanic community in San Antonio. You worked on housing and other urban issues in the Obama administration, and you've recently run for a national campaign as a Democratic candidate for president. And I know a lot of people who truly believed in that effort. What do you say, given your experience, is the most important thing for us to know about Latinos in U.S. politics?
Thank you so much for having me, and to all of the fantastic panelists as well. It's an honor to be with everybody. I would say, if I had to say in one word, what folks should take away from last Tuesday's election with regard to Latinos, it would be that the community is consequential, that it is very consequential in which party will control Congress, in which party will prevail in presidential elections. And that we saw that last week, especially in states like Nevada and in Arizona. And within those states, the counties whose results we were waiting for days in Arizona, from Pima County and from Maricopa County, the two counties where Latinos are aggregated in the state of Arizona, and in Nevada, Clark County and Washoe County, where Latinos tend to live in that state. And so the community is making a big difference in political outcomes in our country at the state level, the national level, and I would say, based on my own experience, also, of course, at the local level. They just called the LA mayor's race. Latinos played a fundamental role in what happened in that race. Secondly, I would say that as I think Olivia said, you can't paint the Latino community with one brush. It is true, and we hear the word monolith, that we're not a monolith, said after every election, and the reason that it is because it's true, right? I would say that there is a clear pattern. Latinos as a whole tend to support Democrats, tend to vote in the low 60s in most places or higher for Democrats in these national elections, but that's not always true, as we saw in Florida and the flipping of Miami-Dade this cycle. In South Texas in 2020, we saw some movement toward Republicans, and we saw the first Latina elected in the 15th congressional district in South Texas, in a district that was about a Trump +3 district, but still, you have folks who are breaking ground. In Oregon, where you're going to have a Latina Republican that was just elected. Overall, I think that Latinos still are firmly Democratic, but in some places there has been movement.
And we are hard to predict, and worth the time that the political parties are spending, I think, to get our vote. Michael, you work with communities in Chicago, and you're on violence prevention, public health, immigration challenges, and other important issues throughout the community, or through your community organizing efforts. Can you give your unique experience about what's the most important thing for us to know about Latinos in U.S. politics?
Yes, thank you, JD. It's good to be with you all. Great to be with the panelists here tonight. For me, something that's critical and vital to this conversation that often is concentrated around where Latinos are going in terms of their electoral politics and their voting record, is that our history is vital to speaking to things that can inform and shape how we look to the future in Latina communities. And by that, I mean, the movements, the organizations, the leaders that really marked the 20th century in our country from the Latino perspective understood that electoral politics mattered. But what mattered most was that Latino communities had to organize people power for their survival. And that when I speak of grassroots people power in Latino communities, I mean the power that we must organize to change laws, to foster safer communities, to address violence, to ensure fair wages and healthy and safe working conditions, to ensure that corporations don't get away with dumping waste, toxic waste in our waters. The kind of power that can be actualized and realized by parents who can come together to improve their schools. This goes well beyond one election or two elections every 2 to 4 years. It's about the everyday realities that Latina and Latino communities face, that we have to come to grips with the importance of building localized power that could be exercised responsibly, strategically, and be done in such a way that it makes manifest our deepest values, our deepest hopes, our aspirations, our dreams. This was the example that was set before us by generations past. And it's easy to just simply focus on the poll numbers. Where are Latinos going? Are they drifting towards Democrats or Republicans? But we have to begin with, are we building power in our communities? And are we doing it in such a way that enables our communities to exercise it responsibly? And that's both a political question at the grassroots level. It's also a deeply spiritual question, because it's the spiritual development and formation of our communities. Alejandra spoke to the religion matters, right? It helps shape our moral imagination and how we exercise power responsibly.
And that certainly, as you said, Michael, takes a lot of time. So we're going to continue to delve deeper into this. Jens Manuel, let's get back to you. Pew has done some incredible unbiased research into this important subset of the electorate. And you've been at the forefront of Pew's work with Latino demographics and public opinion. Can you give us a brief overview of Latinos in the US and their place, roles, history, and impacts in US politics? I said brief, but just asked you a lot, but as brief as you can. We sure do appreciate you setting the table for us this evening.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to run through some of the, I think some of the key facts to keep in mind about the Latino electorate, about Latino eligible voters. And before jumping into some of the political facts that I have to share, I wanted to start with a big demographic trend that has been reshaping the Hispanic population for a couple of decades now. And that is the fact that US-born Hispanics are the primary source of Hispanic population growth today. One result of this is quite striking. It's that every year there are roughly 1 million Latinos who are born in the US who come of age and turn 18. So in other words, every year in this country, there are roughly 1 million new Latino eligible voters. This wasn't always the case. In the 1980s and 1990s, immigration, largely immigration from Mexico, was the primary driver of Hispanic population growth. While there's no doubt that Mexican immigration has deeply shaped the US Latino population, my own mom was a Mexican immigrant. The flow of Hispanic immigration to the US as of 2021 has slowed to a trickle. And as a result, today Hispanics born in the US are the driving force behind Hispanic population growth. So with that said, I wanted to run through some key facts about Latino eligible voters. So how big is the Latino eligible voter population? For this year's midterm elections, there were about 35 million Latinos eligible to vote. And we define eligible voters as US citizens ages 18 or older. That's up from about 14 million in 2000. And as a result of all this, there are about 14% of, or Hispanics are about 14% of eligible voters in the US. That's double the share in 2000 when Hispanics were 7% of Latino eligible voters. If you look at more recent trends, if you just look at changes since 2018 in the US eligible voter population, you can get a sense of how big the Latino eligible voter population is and what role, the large role it plays in driving overall growth in the country's electorate. So since 2018, so from 2018 to 2020, the US eligible voter population grew by about 7.7 million people. Latinos or Hispanics accounted for about 4.7 million of that. So in other words, Hispanics were about 60% of the nation's eligible voter population. And given the fact that Latinos are a large and growing group of the electorate, of the nation's electorate, how do Latinos view the parties? Our most recent report did a deep dive into this, and we found that despite a lot over the past 2 years about the millions of Latinos, new Latinos who voted for Trump in 2020 and the rising number of Latinos voting Republican, we saw that if you pulled back a little bit, you saw that Latinos still saw the Democratic Party more positively than the Republican Party. A clear majority of Latinos said that the Democratic Party works hard to earn Latinos' votes, really cares about Latinos, and represents the interests of people like them. You couldn't say that, Latinos didn't say the same of the Republican Party. About a third of Latinos said the Republican Party really cares about Latinos. About a third said the Republican Party represents the interests of people like them. And interestingly, a somewhat higher percentage, about 45%, said the Republican Party works hard to earn Latinos' votes. And so despite some clear patterns in how Latinos view the parties, there was also a fair amount of ambivalence that Latinos had toward the parties. Fewer than half of Hispanics say there is a great deal of difference between the parties, which is notable in this era that is so polarized. And interestingly, we didn't see a big difference between Democrats and Republicans in this. Another interesting finding was something that didn't really change too much, and that was the party affiliation of Latinos in recent years. It remained relatively steady from 2019 to today. About 2/3 of Latinos said, registered voters said they identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party, and about 1/3 said they identified with the Republican Party. And this has remained fairly steady since 2019, like I said, and this is a time that covers both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And finally, I just wanted to wrap up with a quick look at some historical trends in how Hispanics have actually voted nationally. And so this is a national vote of how Latinos voted in elections. So in 2020, we found, I guess a key point here is kind of that U shape you see in the percent of Hispanics who voted for Republican candidates. So in 2020, 38% of Hispanics voted for Donald Trump. And that's a similar share to 2004, when about 40% of Latinos voted for George W. Bush. And the only kind of technical note I throw out here is that 2020, 2018, and 2016 comes from our validated voter study, which is a little more rigorous methodologically than the previous years, which come from exit polls. And sorry, I just had to throw that in there since I work at Pew Research. But that is kind of gives you an overall look of where things stand with Hispanics today.
Excellent. Thanks, Jens Manuel. So let's get deeper and get behind these numbers here. We're just going to ask you guys each a series of questions. We can start with you, Alejandra, to dig a little bit deeper underneath these numbers that we've just been presented. You do such a great job covering the diverse Latino communities, especially their religious faith and their political choices. So in your reporting, what's going on with Latino voters? For example, like how do issues like the economy, culture, abortion, immigration, inflation, crime, we heard about all of this stuff, right? Threats to democracy. How did all of those issues kind of influence how Latinos engage politically?
Yeah, so the way that I've been able to better understand how Latinos vote, particularly in last week's midterms, is by considering abortion, immigration, religion, and geographic diversity. We've learned that Latinos have overwhelmingly expressed support for abortion rights, especially after Roe was overturned. And I think for a very long time, there have been these assumptions that Latinos are inherently religious and therefore conservative and against abortion. And it's not as black and white as that. One reason is that there is a rise in Latinos who are not religious, and people who are not religious tend to be more progressive and more liberal. And even Latinos who have historically mostly been Catholic, even they have expressed support for reproductive freedom. And this is in polls and recent election polls and in interviews that I've had with Latino Catholics across the country. This includes Latinos who are culturally Catholic, who were maybe raised Catholic, but they themselves don't practice it, or who identify as Catholic as part of their Mexican identity or their Latino identity, as well as practicing Catholics who attend Mass on Sundays or who did their sacraments. And I think back to one interview that I did with a Mexican American Catholic woman in Minnesota. So she's in her 20s, and she told me that she prays a rosary. She even listens to the Bible in a Year podcast. And even she supports access to abortion and birth control. And I remember her talking about how ironic she felt that it was that Catholic clergy who can't marry or have sex, that they dictate church policy about sex, pregnancy, and marriage. And I do think that there is a gap in how day-to-day Catholics, including those who are Latino, feel about abortion, and how the Catholic as an institution and its leadership, who are men, talk and feel about abortion. And when considering geography, we know that Latinos in, let's say, Florida, many who are Cuban, have a different perspective and a different immigrant experience than Latinos in like California, where I am, especially in Southern California, where immigrants, many who are Mexican, Central American, have pushed, their Democratic representatives to enact legislation that allows in-state tuition for undocumented students, healthcare for undocumented children. And when I think about states like Florida, I think of when Trump in 2020 announced his Evangelicals for Trump initiative. And he made this announcement at a Latino mega church. So you have these very high profile Latino evangelical pastors who in the past have spoken in support of Trump because they said he stood, against communism, against socialism. You have pastors like Samuel Rodriguez, who is widely known, who has vouched for Trump because, he has said that under his leadership, Latinos are working and they're getting paid well. So I do think that influential Latino evangelical pastors can or have swayed Latinos in the way they vote on issues like the economy, as well as issues in like abortion. And we've heard a lot about this rise in Latino conservatives, and there are religion experts like I think of Jonathan Calvillo and other Protestant leaders like Elizabeth Rios, who have wondered to what extent are Latino Protestants being pushed in this more conservative direction, because not all Latino Protestants lean Republican, but the voices that speak for them are often more conservative.
Alejandra, you anticipated my next question about the differences between the different faiths. So that's excellent. Thank you for that overview. Olivia, Florida just came up. I know that you're there, and you're a leader in the Republican Party, and you have a lot of impact with Latino voters and women, recruiting women leaders. Can you tell us about how the Republican Party has approached Latino voters, both traditionally and in the last election? So, what are some of the basic themes and strategies that Republicans are using, and has there been something that's kind of central to how the Republican Party is approaching Latinos?
Yeah, sure. I think, I'll start with this cycle. Republicans didn't see as big a gain among Latino voters as I think they might have liked, but I do know that they have been making more of a concerted effort, which is notable. And Republicans know that they need to do more work among these voters. And I think recognizing that is step one. I think in a lot of ways, 2020, they got kind of a good whiff of the benefits of outreach to this community. 2020 was unique in some ways because socialism, and we talked a lot about communism, and that anchored a lot of the messaging for Republicans that cycle. And I think that resonated particularly among Latino communities, immigrant families. And this cycle, Republicans were hoping, that gas, the economy, inflation were going to be that key message. And quite frankly, it fell flat. In fairness, we saw that across the board, not just among Latino voters, but I think going forward that two things will be key. I think one, a message that resonates with a diverse voting bloc, and two, I think the messenger. And in many ways, the group I work with called Winning for Women Action Fund that's one of the groups that's working on that, right? To diversify the party and grow it. And in large part to make sure that our candidates are strong candidates, they're qualified candidates, and that they are diverse candidates, because I think that that's really important. The secretary mentioned this earlier, but I'm gonna repeat their names. We've seen that Latinas make strong candidates. And I'll speak on the Republican side. We saw 2 Latina Republican candidates come out on top in 2 of the most competitive House races this cycle. We have Monica De La Cruz in Texas 15, Lori Chavez DeVee Moore in Oregon 5. Monica ran on faith, family, hard work, strong appeals to a Hispanic and immigrant community. She's also the first GOP woman ever to represent her district. Lori will be the first Hispanic woman ever elected to Congress from her state of Oregon. You have Maria Salazar down in Florida, who defended her seat, which was competitive last cycle, and she won it by over 14 points this cycle. And she's got a strong story to tell. Her community is an exile community. Her parents are Cuban, fled the Castro regime. So I think that these are big wins for the Latino community as a whole. I think they're also big wins for the Republican Party, and we need to see more of the same from the Republican Party in terms of outreach with a strong message, but also making sure that we are helping to elevate and support strong candidates.
We certainly appreciate that perspective and being able to lift up women leaders, as you're saying, and the kind of the gifts that they bring. We can turn to Secretary Castro. You're, as we know, a leading Democrat and former mayor of San Antonio. Can you speak to how the Democratic Party has approached Latino voters? A similar question, both traditionally and if things have changed, what strategies are being employed, and if there is a central message that the Democratic Party is putting out to reach Latinos.
Well, traditionally, a lot of the outreach from the Democratic Party had centered around civil rights and themes like equality, and also aspirational themes and issues like access to better education and healthcare and better jobs. Those things that I think really resonate with hardworking Latino and Latina families all across the United States. In the last 15 years, of course, we also saw an issue that I think became a litmus test for a lot of Latinos, especially in states like Nevada and in California and Arizona more recently, which was immigration. After the push for things like DACA in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and so forth. I think if there's something that we can boil down from the last couple of elections, it's that Latinos and Latinas, right, are just like anybody else, and they have the same concerns that any families out there have. They are also aspirational families, and where I think Democrats have done well is to focus on things like healthcare and education and immigration. I think traditionally where Republicans did well was to focus on issues like small business and an entrepreneurial spirit and on the economy. In Texas, in fact, one of the things that I think didn't necessarily show up, but that if Republicans don't get back to it, I think is going to hurt them with Latinos, was that from George W. Bush to Rick Perry to Greg Abbott, what they built their empire on, so to speak, their success in Texas on, including with Latinos, was this idea that we've done so well for you on the economy. We've created this Texas miracle. Look, all of these companies that are coming to our state, and we're investing in small business and so forth. And because of what happened with the power grid failure and in Uvalde and a couple of other things, they sort of got away from that argument in the 2022 cycle. If you looked at the ads and what people were saying on the stump, and then also the influence of Donald Trump, and so they think they started to veer from that blueprint. For Democrats, I think that we need to remember what it is that resonates with Latino families, and to continue to appeal based on the aspirations that folks have. I mean, it's a community of strivers, of people that are striving and that still believe in the American dream and want their kid, to get a great education and be able to reach their dreams and so forth. And so Democrats would do well to remember that.
I appreciate that. I'm myself, I was born in the Dominican Republic, and immigration is something I think about all the time. Our neighbors next door, they're from Afghanistan. They're refugees from Afghanistan, and we're become friends with them, and it's something that I write about. And but Secretary Castro, time and again, I see that nothing's being done. It doesn't seem to be an issue that is moving voters. When I see these polls, as important as it is to me, it doesn't seem to be something that reaches that level of importance to some of our leaders, at least, for us to actually see change.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you looked at the end of this cycle, right, they had all the polls up about what's on voters' minds, and you saw issues like inflation, you saw abortion, on some of them you saw the issue of preserving democracy and so forth. You didn't see the issue of immigration as much. And so, I mean, but that goes up and down, I think, right? Both in positive ways and negative ways, as far as I see it. But I do think that when you boil it down to the reality that families are living with, you still have all of those dreamers that are out there living in limbo. You still have all of their parents and others who are in mixed status families. And so there is this built-in base of concern there. But I do think that over this last term, this was not something that on the Democratic side, the Biden administration really chose to engage in on the issue of immigration. I mean, they peeled back a couple of Trump executive orders. And on the first day, President Biden came out with an immigration agenda, but really never made it a main priority, a significant priority. And on the flip side, going into this cycle, aside from folks like Greg Abbott and people in Texas, without Trump being as prominent as he had been on immigration over the last several years, immigration in most states, I think, also was not the kind of issue that it had been in 2016, 2018, when you felt the backlash to the 2016 experience. And then, of course, to a lesser extent in 2020.
Michael, just we're talking about, I think you have so much to contribute here, just from a grassroots level, like the everyday concerns of Latinos, and obviously not just the Latinos that vote, because there's a lot of us that aren't citizens here, and we have concerns, and our family members might vote when we can't, and that kind of thing. So can you give us an idea of your take on this? Like, what are the Latino voters, and how are they engaging with parties? What happened in your community during the last election?
Yeah, I think that there's a broad recognition that by millions of people in the country, whether they're Latina, Latino, or of different cultural backgrounds, that our political system is fundamentally broken. And there's so many nuances and complexities to unpack with that. There's certainly profound differences between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So I don't mean to put them both in the same camp. There are very real anti-democratic forces at play at the center of the Republican Party, and that I think is a major factor that played into the recent elections. But by and large, people across the country sense that something is wrong. There's a sense of hopelessness, powerlessness. And I think fundamentally, the solution here is not so much how can we turn out Latino communities to elections every 2 to 4 years, but what role can ordinary people play in shaping the forces and factors that affect their daily lives when it comes to schools, the local economy, the environment, opportunities for their children in the future, fostering safe and vibrant communities. And this is what I'm speaking to when I say that the question is not whether we should or shouldn't seek to build and organize people power, grassroots power in Latino communities, because we must. The more urgent and necessary question is whether we can organize grassroots power in such a way that it is in the collective hands of everyday people, our grandparents, working class people, youth, and that power can be controlled by people and exercised people in ways that are responsible, strategic, shrewd, but that also brings out the best in our humanity and our democracy. And it's a great joy and privilege of mine to be able to do the work that I do, because we get to organize with people who care a hell of a lot for their communities and want to work every day at improving them. And I think that there's a lot of learning that being a part of a civic group, a faith-based organizing coalition, or a church that's engaged in a local community or in society more broadly, there's a lot of good that can come from that for both individuals in Latino communities and for the broader community itself. These centers of democratic engagement provide opportunities to build relationships, which is so important nowadays, given how vast the feeling of isolation is across society, especially post-pandemic. People are more and more isolated, more and more alone, more and more hopeless. When we come together, when we think together, when we talk, when we strategize, when we plan, beautiful things can happen. I love, and I'm a student of Paulo Freire, but within these places of organizing, we talk about full humanization can be realized. That's when we're engaged in public life, engaged in the push and pull, engaged in power politics. We become more keenly aware, more conscientiousized, as Paulo Freire talks about, which is a very Catholic concept too, nurturing our conscience, becoming more critically aware of the forces at play in our society. Why are people poor? Why are working conditions so bad? Why is the environment heating up and becoming more detrimental to our health and to our livelihoods? Why is our politics in the place that it is today? What do vastly powerful corporations and individuals have to do with that? What are the differences between the political parties? And how is it that we need to take ownership for our politics, for our communities, for our neighborhoods, and exercise our vote responsibly, but to do all the work in between then? And I think faith and politics are so intertwined. I appreciate what Alejandra had to say earlier when she spoke to the importance of faith in people's lives in Latina communities. Something that we do through the work I'm involved in at the Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership is we talk a lot about how to foster both people who are deeply engaged in public life, but whose spiritual lives help inform and shape the work they do in civic society. And that's just not for people who can exercise the vote, but most especially as well for people who can't vote. And so, an example of the kind of work that animates people's dreams and visions is, we organized a public meeting during the heart of the pandemic. We couldn't do it in person, so we did it on Zoom, something I'm not fond of. It's hard, it's complicated. People's babies are screaming in the background, and you're trying to organize a public meeting with public officials. And they set the agenda, they ran the meeting. One of the major issues had to do with water, the cleanliness of water, but also how much it cost people in this particular community to turn their water on when it's shut off. $300 plus everything they owe on the water bill. That's democracy at work in the best sense, when people can shape and develop an agenda and own it and run with it.
Well, Michael, I appreciate that you joined us for this Zoom call, even though it's not your favorite. We've gotten a number of great questions from the audience, so we're going to pivot now. You've heard enough of my questions, and we're going to get to the good ones. You know, the best wine for last, etc. Jens Manuel, this seems like a question for you. How do generational differences affect Latino voters' political opinions and activity? Are there important trends? What does this mean in the future as the population of US-born Latinos increases relative to the foreign population? So there's 3 questions there. I don't know if you got all of them. I'm happy to repeat them if need be.
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are some generational differences that we see, starting with the youngest among the youngest group of Latinos. They tend to be largely US born. So in a lot of ways, young Latinos in their political views look a lot like a lot of other young Americans. They tend to be more liberal on issues like the environment and immigration than older Latinos. And older Latinos tend to be more conservative across the board. And that way they do look a little like the rest of the country. One thing that is interesting about the generational differences is that a lot of Latinos fall into these groups of Republicans and Democrats that we consider having weaker ties to the parties. So they might be more, Republicans might be more moderate on immigration issues and some social issues, but they tilt Republican. They might not want Trump to remain in politics, and they are quite young, these kinds of Republicans. And for Democrats, a lot of the youngest Democrats who are Latinos tend to be very liberal on issues like climate and race. They are the least active politically of any of the Democratic groups we've categorized. But they do tend to vote Democratic despite being dissatisfied with both parties. So those are some of the trends we see by generation.
And Olivia, this sounds like a question for you. Maybe Olivia and Secretary Castro, if you're willing to as well. Why do we notice less attachment to or identification with the 2 major political parties? We heard that earlier. Latinos relative to the general U.S. adult population are less connected to the parties. Does that mean something to you as you're doing your work, that you hear that Latinos are less connected to parties?
Yeah, I guess I'll speak kind of from personal and firsthand experience. I think that there are aspects of both parties that no one are, in a lot of ways, too extreme here and too extreme here. I think there are a lot of people who fall kind of in the middle, who there are things from the right that they agree with, things from the left that they agree with, and things that they don't. I think, Jens, you mentioned this off the top, but Latinos and Latinas oftentimes don't find a home in either party. Speaking with my kind of Republican hat, I think in a lot of ways that's a good opening for the Republican Party to do more, make more of a concerted effort, make sure that they're going back to those Republican roots and values, and that message is reaching Latino voters. And also back to my kind of more consistent point of the night is our candidates matter. And the more diversity that we can bring into the Republican Party, the more diverse and unique perspectives that we can bring here to Washington and Congress, make sure everyone has a seat at the table, I think the better, because you're talking to more people than ever before, and you can maybe solve for a little bit of that problem.
And Secretary Castro, if you want to weigh in just a little on this general question of how Latinos tend to affiliate less with either political party, and what that means for Democrats as they're trying to reach out to them?
Yeah, well, and I'll take that question last. I mean, what it means is that both parties are going to have to compete vigorously for Latinos and Latinas, and they'd be advised to do so. I think part of it is Republicans in the last couple of cycles have started to spend more on Spanish language media, it seems like, especially in certain congressional races. They're recruiting more, particularly in certain areas of the country. In terms of kind of more of the historical pattern of that, I'd love to see a disaggregation, for instance, of by national origin and how true that is, and also generationally and how true that is. Thirdly, the Latino community is a young community overall, and I think that the younger you get in politics, the more you tend to have less of loyalty to one party or another. And then finally, part of it might be frustration with lack of movement on some issues, whether it's immigration or other issues. You know, my mother was a Chicana activist in the 1970s, and they were very frustrated with the political system. This was mostly Mexican Americans in Texas and the Southwest, and their answer was to leave the Democratic Party, but not to go to the Republican Party. They started a third party called the Raza Unida Party, which was a Chicano-Chicana third party. And so I say that to say that there's a history in the community of frustration because we've not seen the kind of progress that you would like to see, whether economically or educationally or health outcomes or more recently immigration and so forth.
I want to maybe connect that with Jens Manuel, just a question that I had as you were going through your presentation, because we saw in this election a lot of independent voters, and like once again the value of the swing voters. You in your breakdowns, it was you broke it down with Republican and Democrat. Do you see a move toward more independence among the Latino community?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have seen a rising, a trend going back a decade or more of a growing number of Latinos who don't think either party really represents them very well. And the percentage of Latinos who say Democrats or Republicans represent them very well has remained somewhat static. But it's that percentage of Latinos who say neither party represents them very well that has grown. And another data point that kind of speaks to this is that in our pre-election survey, it was really notable the substantial share of Latinos when asked who are they planning to vote for in their local congressional race. It was something about 1 in 4 of Latinos said they plan to not vote for a Democrat or Republican, or were undecided. So you had 1 in 4 Latinos registered voters who said they weren't sure, and this was just a few weeks before the election, and that really stood out for me.
Alejandra, if I can direct this question to you. So how do cultural values and solidarity in Latino communities affect their political behavior, or perhaps even their economic class? Do you see a connection there in your reporting?
In terms of, I've been spending a lot of time on abortion, and even myself as a reporter who covers religion, I mean, I did not grow up in a religious household. I grew up culturally Catholic. But when I think about, before I was a religion reporter, when I thought about a person who was religious, I automatically linked them to being more conservative among Latinos, being more conservative against abortion. And so learning about their faith upbringing, lack of faith upbringing, and how they feel about issues about abortion and immigration and how that's linked to their spiritual lives has really helped me understand how they how they vote. And I think I spent a lot of times as a reporter ignoring religion. And I realized that I really missed out in really understanding the whole being of how Latinos approach certain issues or feel about certain issues.
I don't know, Michael, if you'd care to comment on that too, about cultural values and solidarity, and that seems like it may be something you could comment on as well as in your community organizing.
Sure, absolutely, JD. Something that, as I've reflected back on my life, that I think has been so pivotal to me, as I think it is for so many, is those formative years when we were young. My mother's Mexicana. She spoke to me when I was growing up of her experience meeting Cesar Chavez and how profoundly impactful that was for her. On my father's side, he's a refugee from Poland and lived very close to where the Solidarity movement began. He grew up in Gdynia, Poland. And that both those movements in Poland and here in the United States were led by working class people, by people who formed unions. But both those movements really were animated by these deep faith values, by these deep spiritual convictions that had profound political implications that went far beyond a political status quo. And I think that that's something that's so important. We have to reclaim the spiritual and moral center of our religious and spiritual lives in Latino communities. And we have to be aware, deeply aware of how religion is and how our culture is often co-opted for political purposes. Our faith, our Christian faith, our Catholic faith is not a pro-capitalistic, nor is it a patriotic, you go United States type faith. We have to reclaim this Jesus who was profoundly disruptive to the status quo, to the Roman Empire, who stood with people who were suffering and struggling, who recognized that vast income inequalities was a scandal in God's eyes, and who recognized that it was the people that God was calling to transform the world, to work for what Jesus called the kingdom of God, the reign of God, which ushered in vast equality, humanity, dignity, respect, love, that all of this had profound political implications. And we have to reclaim this. I think that this is so central to what role Latina communities can and should play in the 21st century. And we need to look to our churches, not necessarily to our bishops or our pastors, but to ourselves. The faith that speaks to justice lives in our households and our communities, just like it did for me growing up. My mom would take me to church 4 days a week. It drove us crazy, but that's what helped shape who I am today. And I think that culture and faith play a big part in our communities, and that there's profound spiritual and political implications in that for the good.
Michael and Olivia also talked about character and about, we're talking about candidate character here as well. And so Olivia in particular, you spoke about how the choice of the candidate, it was really important. How do you how do parties identify strong candidates, and how do they build and support both within the party and among the electorate to kind of bring those candidates forward? I don't know if Olivia, you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the work that Winning for Women Action Fund does, but it's actually it's a fairly new organization. It's the first outside group on the Republican side dedicated to electing women, and it's a new organization. So needless to say, badly needed on the right. So I think first, like the existence of groups like that on the right in particular, to make sure that we are kind of reaching into all corners of the country and all corners of the party to find people who might not have otherwise thought to run for office or thought they were qualified to run for office, to make sure that we are finding the best of the best and we're finding people who are good fits for their district. who have common sense solutions, willing to work across the aisle when need be, and then making sure that they have support from groups like ours, that they're kind of surrounded by a good team, that they know what it takes to win, fundraising efforts and the like. But kind of more generally speaking, I think groups like that are important to kind of the ecosystem of politics, the ecosystem of the Republican Party, and making sure that they exist, that they are effective, and that, you know, the party at large can get behind the cause.
Secretary Castro, I want to direct this question to you. There's, we should have done this audience. The audience questions are so good. We should have just done this from the beginning. Yeah, they're just really great and very difficult questions, perhaps. But we've heard about in the past, and we know that the Republican Party has, in a way, a successful strategy of painting the Democratic candidates as socialists, especially among Latinos who have painful histories with leftist regimes. What is the Democratic Party's response to this strategy? And, you know, has that been working?
Yeah, and that's a strategy that's been deployed for quite a while, but, you know, was deployed very sharply in 2020 election and also again in 2022. I think you're right that it, you know, it works to varying degrees in different cycles, and also with folks based on national origin, based on their experience coming from the country that they came from or their family came from. And I think Democrats have generally done a pretty good job of rebutting that and pointing out what Democrats actually believe in, and the type of economic programs and other investments that they want to make, and distinguishing that from some of the things that concern voters who might be Cuban American in South Florida or Venezuelan American. But also, I think, you know, doing it in a way that doesn't back off from the values that we have of ensuring that we achieve in our country greater equality, and that we concern ourselves not only for folks who are doing well, but also people who are struggling. You know, I don't know that, because I've seen this in the last few days, right? And I saw it after the 2020 election. People have been quick to ascribe success with Latinos in South Florida, especially, to the labeling of folks as socialist or communist. I don't know that that's the case. I haven't seen compelling evidence that that's the case. But what I do think is that Democrats need to do a good job of messaging and resonating around that aspirational outlook that Latinos and Latinas have, and a message of opportunity for people, educational opportunity, economic opportunity, healthcare opportunity, because I do think that that goes a long way with the community.
And we're going to switch it up a little bit here, just because we're starting to run low on time, and this conversation could go on for a lot longer, especially as we've been talking about the complexity and the intricacy of our communities and how they continue to change over time. So I'm going to ask each of you to, if you, in a minute or less, to kind of answer our central question for this dialogue, which is, how are Latinos changing politics, and how are politics changing Latinos? Jens Manuel, if we can start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one way to think about this is that, in terms of a political context, is that crafting messages that appeal to your bases, and crafting ones that appeal to a decent share of Latino partisans, those might be somewhat different things. And I've covered some of this, but our research shows that roughly half of Latino Democrats and roughly half of Latino Republicans don't fall into these groups that we consider to be strong or solid partisan groups. And so seeing how the parties react to this will be interesting to see going forward. It'll also be interesting to see how the political views of the next generation of Latino eligible voters develops. This is a largely US born electorate from a population that has a significant presence today in every corner of the country. It's not just in the Southwest or in Texas or in Florida or New York. It's in the heartland, it's in the Southeast, it's in the Pacific Northwest. There are substantial populations of Hispanics everywhere in the US today. And so today's emerging Latino electorate is quite different demographically from that of their parents or even grandparents.
And Alejandra, the same question for you. How are Latinos changing politics, and how are politics changing Latinos?
I think Latinos recognize when they're being pandered to. And I think about the election right here in LA. We just learned that Karen Bass will be the first Black woman mayor in the city, and her opponent, Rick Caruso, spent more than $100 million in the campaign, and he heavily, some would say he pandered to Latinos in the city. And I think more and more younger Latinos are recognizing when they are being pandered to. And so I think it's important to realize that much, that as younger Latinos, they are skewing elections on the progressive side, and they are recognizing when they're being used, or when messaging, when certain messaging is just not jiving with them.
And Olivia, the same question to you. How are Latinos changing politics, and how are politics changing Latinos?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I think you can no longer have a conversation about US politics and US elections without talking about Latinos. And I think that is incredibly empowering. And politicians on both sides of the aisle need to work very hard to earn the Latino vote.
And Secretary Castro, same question. How are Latinos changing politics, and how are politics changing Latinos?
They're changing politics in one way by reordering the map to become president of the United States. The center of gravity is moving from where it traditionally had been in the Northeast, the Midwest, to the Southwest and the West. And that was also true in this election cycle for the battle for the Senate. That's one way. I think there are different ways. In terms of how are politics changing Latinos, I think that it's galvanizing a new generation of young Latinos and Latinas around certain issues. 10 years ago, it was immigration, and all of the efforts that were led by young Latinos and Latinas around coming up with comprehensive immigration reform, and then ultimately DACA and DAPA and so forth. And these days, involvement in climate justice and student loan debt cancellation. So I think it's helping to energize a new generation with a unique perspective on this. And I think for some, it's also this moment where they're more in the spotlight, and perhaps will solidify a group identity for some, and then for others make them run for that quicker because they are more in the spotlight or have a target on their back.
Michael, how are Latinos changing politics, and how are politics changing Latinos?
Something that I've been deeply inspired by over the last 5-10 years has been the movement amongst youth and families for immigration reform in this country, the risks, the sacrifices that people have taken to push this country further and further along the line towards comprehensive immigration reform, to me speaks to something that we've got to continue to do in our communities, which is become anchors. People who have a clear moral, spiritual, and political vision for our communities, who aren't easily swayed when it comes to election season, but who know what their communities need and who know are going to represent them, and who are able to practice both political shrewdness and spiritual discernment, which are deeply interconnected and intertwined tools. We've got to be anchors in our community who know what our communities need and want, and who are able to engage in the rough and tumble of public life together with one another, to pursue the common good, to hold our elected officials accountable, to vote the wrong people out of office and vote the right people in office. And I don't mean to sound like politics only need be antagonistic, but oftentimes we see that historically speaking, social change is possible on a grand scale when we have a strong, united, strategic grassroots movement, along with elected officials who are in office, who are capable, who are willing, and who need a strong, united grassroots base to move the country in the right direction. We need both the grassroots and the grass tops, but we've got to be anchors for spiritual and public good in our community.
Wow, you guys, thanks so much to all of you, Jens Manuel, Alejandra, Olivia, Secretary Castro, and Michael. And thank all of you for joining us for this important conversation. Just as a reminder that the discussion was recorded and will be posted on the initiative's website and social channels, and we have follow-up resources from the discussion posted there too. We hope you can join us for the initiative tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. in Riggs Library at Georgetown. Gorgeous library, worth the trip just for the library, or online via live stream for another important dialogue on the midterms, faith and the faithful in the midterm elections, an election roundtable on what happened, why, and what it means for the future. To discuss the role of faith and religious voters in these past elections, we'll hear from Susan Crabtree from Real Clear Politics, who covers Republicans, William Galston from Brookings, who has been a leader in the Democratic Party for decades, Jack Jenkins from Religious News Service, who is a leader in religious communities and US politics, Sabrina Rodriguez from the Washington Post, who is a leading reporter on Latino voters, and Eugene Scott, also from the Washington Post, who covers the Black community and political identity and trends. The initiative is also planning a dialogue on Catholics and the crisis of democracy in December. So look out for that and much more. Please visit the initiative's website for updates on these upcoming gatherings. I want to thank especially the initiative team, John Carr, Kim Daniels, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sunin for all their help putting this dialogue together. And finally, please join me in thanking Jens Manuel Krogstad, Alejandra Molina, Olivia Perez Cubas, Secretary Julian Castro, and Michael Okisnik Cruz for being part of this Latino Leaders Gathering on how Latinos are changing politics and how politics are changing Latinos. Thank you very much.